Let's look at all of justice and how it works. And then you say, let's come up with a framework to help the students understand that. And the framework talks about very simple components that all the students can relate to: issues of social class, issues of race, immigration, and social control. So then the question is, okay, so how do we localize it? Well, the answer is, well, let's start with Philadelphia. All right, we're here inside City Hall with a lot of pigeons and a plaque that was dedicated to Brigadier General Smedley Darlington Butler. He was the Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia from 1924 through 1925. Philadelphia was in need of some help at that time because the city was politically wet. That is, they did not take prohibition that seriously. Philadelphia was so notorious as a wet city that it even got written up in magazines at the time as one of the best places to go and find a drink if you wanted one. Butler was not a wuss. He was a tough guy, but Philadelphia was one battle that he could not win. So what he did in very early December 1925 was court personnel raided the Ritz-Carlton Hotel here. What was going on at the time was a very large society function, and the court personnel walked into the ballroom, walked over to a table that was holding refreshments, took several bottles of a suspicious nature, and they discovered that, lo and behold, there was alcohol involved here. And everybody was pretty aghast because this was an event that was patronized by the wealthy and the powerful, to be very simple about it. At that point, Mayor Kendrick fired Smedley Darlington Butler. Okay, we're standing at the corner of 10th and Cuthbert, and there are two alleys here, one to the west of 10th Street, one to the east. And on an August night in 1928, there was an event that shocked, appalled, and horrified Philadelphia when they woke up the next morning. There's one project that students have done where they go and look at two locations downtown. Two locations. One is the site of a former fairly famous speakeasy. The other is the site of a former hotel. One site was heavily raided by police. The other site was not. And what students do is they go to these two sites, they look at what's happening there, and they make inferences based on what they see and who they see and how folks are dressed. They make inferences about social class differences that still exist today. The idea of starting in 1924 and 1925 was that, okay, if we're starting in 1924 and 1925 and certain things are going on, and we see that those things were going on in the 1920s, and the 1930s, and in the 1980s, and guess what, still in the 1990s, then that should give folks a clue that there are some issues going on here that are fairly sizable, fairly substantial, and from a practical point of view, extremely difficult to reform, fix, and change. The last week or so in the course, we do what's called a futurology section, and we look at recent changes in structure of society, whether we're talking about immigration or we're talking about changes in structural inequality, differences between the really wealthy and the really poor. And then the students in small groups will sort of work with that and say, okay, if that's going on, and if that's going to continue for the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, how is it going to change the way agents of justice do their job? If you're a student, you're experienced with and bombarded with and numbed by massive amounts of information from all over the place. And one of the things we work on in this course is how do you discriminate between primary documents and secondary documents. We're encouraged as the semester goes along to repeatedly go to news sources that were written at the time things were happening. They can get that by going to the newspaper clippings file at Paley Library. The Urban Archives is an amazing source of Philadelphia information. We also did a virtual tour of the Philadelphia City Archive where they can look up court records in the 1920s. And they did real visits to the Federal Mid-Atlantic Urban Archive where they can go and look up census information from 1920 and 1930. So when they're reading about police that were involved in corruption, they can go and look up, where did these folks live? Who are their neighbors? How many kids were living there? What I encourage the students to do is to keep their processing going on two parallel tracks. Number one, what's going on in the moral realm? Should this be going on? And sort of keep that separate from, okay, what's happening in the realistic track? How are these folks behaving? How are they being responded to?